Well, hello there. Hello and welcome. Welcome one, welcome all. I do pray back up a little bit, camera. Thank you. I do pray you're doing very, very well out there in the world. It is nighttime, so I may be speaking slightly quieter, but of course the microphone is slightly closer and therefore should not be a hindrance on your ability to hear me. If you can hear me, please like the video. That way I can know that you hear me. Um that's the only way. Liking the video also actually tells me that you're safe and that you're alive and that um you're having a nice time. So like the video. It communicates so very much crucial information. Um that I just need you to do it. Also, consider subscribing to the channels. If you like multiple videos, then you might as well, because it's like we already are an item, but you don't want to wear your ring out in public or something. Um so like the video, subscribe to the channels. If you are here, good people, then you are in for some real conversations regarding natural law, religion, the good, the bad, and the ugly, money, anarchy, culture, yawns, and how mankind is manipulated by forces that do not have our best interests at heart, because perhaps they are completely evil. Now, I say we talk about religion, and we do. We don't bash faith systems here. Okay, we're not calling people names for having a religion. We are simply examining the psychological affects and effects of the stories that we have the most faith in life, ones we have the most stake in, and how those stories help shape society. And that examination of stories has to sit right alongside an honest look at the current human condition, which is slavery. Government is slavery, good people. And the question we have to keep coming back to is what can actually be improved with a proper understanding of the inner storyteller and how it works. And if any of that makes you a little uneasy or makes you a little angry or uncomfortable, please be assured and reassured that although you are encouraged to stay, you are always welcome to leave after you like the video. Can't leave unless you like the video, because that also tells me that, like, you want to leave. When you do it and you act and you have the intention to leave, like, right at the forefront of your mind, then, like, the exit appears right behind you and you can click on it. So don't try to leave without liking the video. Now, let us put our picture up so that you can have something to look at as I introduce today's topic here, which is they give us stories and we live the consequences, part two. And today we're talking about really who writes these stories that we are given from the systems. Um, yeah, who writes these stories and how far back does their influence actually go? Very important questions. Because last episode we looked at how we react to tragedy, right? We talked about the sorting function, how the sorting function of the inner storyteller files the story before any examination of said, alleged facts can occur. How both the Charlie Kirk case and the Carmelo Anthony case produced reactions that were organized around pre-existing conditions, like pre-existing stories running in the mind, rather than around the specific facts of the specific events. And today I want to go a level deeper on that. That's why it's part two. Now, I want to go a little deeper because I didn't really fully answer a certain question. The question I didn't fully answer is the one that's been sitting kind of underneath yesterday's content and really underneath a lot of episodes. This question, not just why do we react to, pre-written stories running in our mind, not just that, but who actually writes the stories that get programmed, what they are offered and or threatened with to write the story in the way that they wrote it, and how far back that pattern of influence actually goes when we consider that humanity has been at war for millennia, right? We have been unwitting participants in a spiritual war for thousands of years. And um, throughout that, we also have our sort of human story. Well, what we call the human story, we call history, okay, his story. But history, by and large part, is not known instantly through telepathy or something. It's written down, okay? History is made official by writings being officialized and authenticated. And of course, when you're dealing with authentication processes, you're dealing with human beings. Okay, you're dealing with systems built by human beings. You're dealing with individuals making individual decisions throughout the process of making said systems, as well as throughout the process of um, making official a single document or a single book or a single curriculum, um, piece of curriculum for the kind of universal standards of what history kids should be learning in government school, public school, and that's the direction we're going to go in. So let's because who actually writes the stories gets to direct certain parts of worldview, okay, in the public. So let's start with something that seems obvious once you say it out loud. The people who write history, the historians, the journalists, the organizers of information, the institutions that found and fund, and distribute the record. These are not exempt from the same vulnerabilities as the people reading their work. Okay? The people that write history are just as human as those who read it. They have the same basic desires as every other human being. They want power, they want financial freedom, they want to do something meaningful for the people they love, right? Their children, their spouse, their mother. They want the good experiences of life, genuinely good food, good adventure, good sex, maybe, right? And these are not all corrupt desires, these are human desires. Every person who has ever written a word of history, filed a news story, or organized an institution's account of events shared these desires with every person who ever read what they produced. And each of these desires creates a specific but exploitable vulnerability, which is the desire for power and financial freedom creates susceptibility to an offer. Gotta sneeze. Right? When you have the desire for power, when you have the desire or desperation for financial freedom, that creates a susceptibility to an offer. It doesn't create a susceptibility that will be taken by everyone in those situations, but or everyone with yeah, those desires, or anything. But it does create some susceptibility, and it doesn't have to be a dramatic offer. It could be a quiet one, right? A grant, a publishing deal, an invitation to a meeting, right, with people who can make certain things happen through their network. A desire to provide for and protect the people you love creates susceptibility to threats, right? Because threatening you directly may not be necessary or a good strategy, depending on your personality. If threatening what you've built or who you've found and brought into your life is sufficient, right? The desire to see yourself as doing good or doing principled work in the world creates susceptibility to self deception, right? The story that you tell yourself about why you're doing something that's misaligned with your values, even when something deep down knows that you shouldn't be. That third one is the inner storyteller doing what it is built to do, which is accept pointing inward, excuse me, doing what it is built to do, except pointing inward to protect the ego rather than outward to examine the world. That's why I wrote that like that. Okay. Sorry. Okay. The desires create the susceptibilities, right? If you have these desires for power, susceptible to an offer. You have these desires for um to be seen as doing good work. Uh you are susceptible to self-deception, and the desire to protect and provide for people that you love creates a little susceptibility to threat, right? Because they can threaten you or they can threaten what you love, whether that's something you built or whatever. But that third one, the desire to see yourself as doing good, is it's a more sophisticated vulnerability, self-deception, right? The hardest one to break is the third one, because the person running it is genuinely convinced that they're doing good in the world. And so they're not lying to themselves, at least not in their heads. They are living inside of a story about themselves that was carefully constructed and handed back to them as their own conclusions. They are victims. So, how does influence actually work in the world? Well, let's examine that a little bit. Let me just be vulnerable with you all for a second. I hate when I structure something a certain way in my notes, and then, a lot of stuff happens, some hours pass. I finally sit down to do the podcast, and I'm reading everything, and everything is flowing smoothly, and I'm able to riff and then come back to my notes and then riff again and whatnot. And then I get to a part where I wrote something in a way that it was supposed to like be revealed as like a punchline kind of thing, and I completely forget the punchline. And then when I get there, I'm like, wait a minute, what did I just say? I hate when that happens. And as a relatively new podcaster, that's been happening. Um, Not more and more often, as in it like, I don't think it happened yesterday, but it's just annoying when it does happen. Okay, had to had to get that off my chest here. Um, let's keep going. we don't want to be uh we don't want to be caught slipping out here. So here's the thing. You don't need to coerce a talented historian with force or a respected journalist with force to get the story that you need officialized and authenticated into history. You don't need to show up at their door with guns drawn and, you know, demands being shouted, right? Now, you can do that. That's a method that's available in the universe, but that's insufficient and it leaves evidence. And if you're going to do it right, what you need is much simpler. All you need is their mailing address, right? And if a family, let's say the Rockefellers, for a documented example, if a family like the Rockefellers wants to shape how a body of knowledge gets organized and transmitted through their school system, the first step is identifying who is already organizing information with credibility and some reach, who's already established in the art or field of organizing historical facts to be taught, to be recognized as history. I think I can make myself bigger again. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you have to make contact. So you get their mailing address, then you make contact. And the contact doesn't have to look like control. It could at first look like support, funding, an invitation to collaborate, an invitation to, you know, increase your exposure, um, an invitation to be a part of a project that's going to benefit everybody, right? And then infiltration, initiation, re education, or some combination of any of those, rhyme intended, by the way. The mechanism may vary, but the result is consistent, right? Whether you're infiltrated, initiated into some sort of secret society or just an ideology, re educated, or some combination of the three, the result is consistent. The person being influenced often does not experience it as influence necessarily, they experience it as opportunity, recognition, the natural consequence to their talent being noticed by people who have the resources to support it meaningfully. And, where the status of the person being approached becomes the vulnerability is the more credibility a historian or journalist already has, the more they have to lose to a degree. The more they've invested into their reputation, into their, institution, if they're a part of one, into their body of work, the more susceptible they are to things that threaten their reputation, their institution, their body of work, right? Blackmail is a thing. And blackmail doesn't have to be explicit to function, right? We explained this in an earlier episode. The awareness that something exists, that something uh, someone has could damage what you've spent your life building, if released to the public, produces compliance in most personality types, okay, in most people. And threat doesn't really have to enter the picture. The person being controlled does it themselves as a coping and survival mechanism. The Rockefeller Foundation's influence on the medical education through the Flexner Report of 1910 is a very clean and documented example of exactly what we're talking about. That report evaluated medical schools across America and its recommendations led directly to the closure of the majority of them, specifically the ones teaching herbal medicine, homeopathy, and other traditions that competed with pharmaceutical interventions, right? The schools that survived were the ones that received Rockefeller funding and taught the petrochemical based pharmaceutical model of practicing medicine, right? The competing traditions, homeopathy, home remedies, learning how to do it yourself and teaching people how to do it yourself, basically, they didn't lose a philosophical debate. They didn't have to. They lost institutional funding and the right to compete, right? They lost access to the channels through which the next generation of doctors may be trained. Within a single generation, an entire body of medical knowledge was removed from all official educational record, and not by force, but by targeted investment and targeted defunding. And that's not alleged, that's documented institutional history 100 years ago in living memory of still people alive today. And many of them have written books and been on podcasts and told the story. Now ask yourself the obvious next question. If that happened that cleanly and that completely in medicine in the last century, what is the reasonable assumption about whether or not a similar influence was applied to the writing of history, political history, spiritual history, cultural history, and most importantly, economic history across the same time period and much older? How much of this same kind of influence is a part of writing history? And this is what we're here to talk about, good people. Is our history influenced through the same kinds of um, vulnerabilities, or through the exploitation of the same kind of vulnerabilities that we can see other people, and their talents are being exploited to promote, you know, ideas that are not necessarily their own. Like the person that's talented pushing certain ideas that are not their own because they're threatened or tempted to do so. We have documented and known stories about celebrities, for instance, right? Talented, genuinely skilled people recognized in the real world for their real ability. And these stories about the celebrities who reached a certain level of success are often coupled, when you look beneath the surface, with the story of their making a choice. Okay. Now, we don't have a complete list of who said yes and who said no when it was time to make this choice. And we don't know each individual's private conversation record. But we do have a pattern. For instance, and Dave Chappelle talked about this very eloquently, Cat Williams has talked about this very eloquently. We don't know of the many black men in Hollywood who were asked to put on a dress. We don't know how who agreed and whose idea it was originally, and who disagreed to go along with the ritual of putting on a dress, right? As a man and as a black man in Hollywood. We don't know of many black men in Hollywood who were asked to put on a dress. We also don't know who was asked to put on a dress and did so unsuccessfully. We know a significant number of them put on a dress. We don't know each case, pardon me, whether it was their own idea or whether the studio came to them with the idea as a condition of something they wanted. We don't know what was on the table, what was on the line in each individual negotiation, but we do know there's a lot of success that follows this ritual. And that correlation in itself is data because the mechanism isn't mysterious when you understand the basic desires and what leverage looks like in practice. The entry point is always something comprehensible and sympathetic. You want more of what success has to provide. You want the protection of what you've built. You want to do something good for the people that depend on you. And then someone with access to the next level of what you want makes a request that may be slightly, then maybe more slightly outside of what you actually agreed to voluntarily. The compromise may be small at first, right? And the next one, a little larger. And by the time the compromise is visible from the outside, the person making these compromises is too far inside of the architecture to easily exit and too invested in the self story that protects them from seeing it clearly, that cognitive dissonance, to do anything differently, right? And this is not unique to Hollywood celebrities. It's the same mechanism operating in journalism, academia, government, religious institutions, and every other domain where talented people with credibility reach become useful to people with resources and agenda, right? The dress that you wear is just the most visible and verifiable version that correlates with subsequent success that we can see, but it's not the point of this episode. And here's where I want to be precise about what I'm claiming and what I'm not. I'm not saying I can provide or prove that the dark occult has been rewriting history for thousands of years on all official documentation, right? I don't have any documentation or evidence for that claim, and I'm not making it. What I'm saying is based on the patterns we can observe today, the Rockefeller Medical School example, the celebrity compliance patterns, the coordinated suppression of specific conversations, like in the Candace uh, saga with Mitch Snow, and or pretty much everything Candace has, tried to do since um, turning away from the pro-Zionist cause. Knowing how intricate and sophisticated these methods of influence can be, the extent of similar methods going further back in time is not necessarily just some sort of fringe inference, right? It's the obvious, logical consequence of asking when the motive first existed. And of course, what is the motive? What is something universally tied to our access to adventure, our access to intimacy, our access to power, and our access to influence? That would be money. The first motive to rewrite history existed at least as far back as the religion of monetary value. Depending on who you ask, that goes back somewhere between 6 and 15,000 years, right? Depending on who you ask about when Sumer actually um, popped up with all of these firsts, like the first writing, the first forms of currency, first forms of banking, first forms of accounting, right? Sumeria or Sumer, pardon me. The Sumerians had the first everything writing wise. And the specific date matters not. As long as there has been a system that concentrates resource allocation in the hands of a small class of people who control the rules and form of the system of money, what I describe as the religion of monetary value, there has been motive to control the story about said system and the reach of that system, to make it feel ancient, natural, necessary, and divinely ordained rather than constructed, maintained, and designed to serve the interests of the people running the system. History was likely rewritten from the beginning or manipulated from the beginning. The internet didn't create narrative control. The internet did not create the infrastructure through which populations receive their understanding of what's real and what's not real in history, right? It made that infrastructure visible to a larger audience, which is why the suppression that we see today and the coordination against specific conversations, the defunding of specific voices, the reputation attacks on specific people is so urgent and so visible. The architecture is being strained by an audience who is waking up. Okay. We are waking up. Hello. Somebody is viewing the podcast. Hello, podcast viewer. Much love to you. What does this mean for how we read history? Right. And this is my last little section of my notes here. Every piece of history that you've received in school, church, the news, the books considered authoritative on culture, every piece of history was written by a human being that has the same basic vulnerabilities and desires that you have. They were subject to the same offers, the same threats, the same capacity for self deception about whether they are doing something right as anyone else. And that doesn't mean everything written in history is false. Of course not. It means everything written was produced by someone who could be influenced, and in many cases was, which means the appropriate relationship to receive history is not automatic trust or just reflexive dismissal, and rigid skepticism either. It's an examination, the same standard that we apply to every other story on this channel. What does the history tell? Who benefits from the story being told in that way? And does that benefit smell like manipulation? What would have been true for the person who wrote it to have written it differently? And does that scenario seem likely or unlikely given what we know about how influence works? These are not cynical questions. These are questions of someone who takes history seriously enough to want the real version rather than the managed version. Because unfortunately, right now, they give us the stories, right? They own the institutions, not just as individuals, as civilizations. And for generations, a very small few, they give us the stories. And until enough people examine the mechanism rather than just reacting to the output, we may not see that change. So the question we have to keep coming back to, and that we always keep coming back to on this channel, good people, is what story are you willing to live? Please let me know in the comments. Please like the video, subscribe to the channels, and I will see you tomorrow in the next episode. Peace and love.